If you've seen pretty much any poi video made in the last 10 years, then you have definitely seen his impact. I'm talking, of course, about Cyrille Humen, a poi spinner who I've argued is the father of the contemporary poi style that I like to call manipulation. I've talked about his place in poi history and why his work had the impact that it has had. But what's talked about a lot less are what exactly are the hallmarks of his style and what it is his work appears to be trying to achieve. Hi, my name is Drex, and I'm a poi dancer from Washington, D.C. I've been thinking a lot in the past year about the roots of modern poi and who were the thinkers that led us here. And among the names that popped up in that review, Cyrille's name was definitely near the top of the list. And if you want some context, I did a video over on my other channel talking about Cyrille's place in poi history, how he shifted the conversation around what the vocabulary of poi was, and how it started the contact poi and manipulation revolution. I'll link to that video down in the description, but here are the Cliff's Notes real quick. Cyrille Humen is a French poi spinner who was part of the mid to late 2000s wave of tech poi, publishing an expansive document on poi spinning and geometry, and producing work that sat easily alongside that of contemporaries like Alien John and Zan Moore. But all that changed in 2010 when he released a video called Manipoi that radically altered the poi landscape by igniting a fever for contact poi, after which this not only became one of the most popular styles to learn in the poi world, but also the default form factor even to the present day. He followed up Manipoi with two other hugely influential videos, Melting Poi and Brainstorming. These videos expanded on his experiments fusing together poi with juggling by adding other forms of prop manipulation, throws, negative space, and various types of isolations and stalls to his work. This trio of videos outlined the vocabulary for a school of poi performance that I like to call manipulation, that is centered around merging together poi with principles of juggling, virtuosic displays of control over the poi's movement, and cleanliness of technique above all else. We've been in the paradigm of manipulation ever since in the poi world. You pull up a random poi video on Instagram or TikTok, and it's pretty likely you're going to see somebody roll a spherical poi head around on their body, or throw it and catch it in an unexpected fashion. This is the style that many, if not most, contemporary poi spinners aspire to learn. That's all good information to have, but it does kind of leave a big gaping question open. Namely, why? Why switch from pattern spinning to contact poi? Why did Cyrille's style change so radically in those first few years of the 2010s? And are there themes that we can chart in his work throughout those radical changes? Spoilers, I think the answer is yes, but it's going to take some work to understand why. First up, I think that it's important to point out that to the best of my knowledge, Cyrille has been a multi-prop artist for the entirety of his career. You go back and look at the first few videos posted to his channel, and you're as likely to see videos on contact juggling or iso sticks as you are on poi. Exploring the intersections of these different props has been something that he's been doing right from the start. We find evidence of this in the paper on poi spinning and geometry that I mentioned earlier, where many of his diagrams depict patterns that are physically impossible to perform with poi, but are being shared anyway as other props of interest to him can perform them. So while the idea of fusing poi with contact juggling was absolutely not on the horizon of tech poi spinners whose names were not Ronan McLaughlin in the late 2000s, this kind of prop fusion work was certainly not new for Cyrille. But I also want to dig a bit deeper into this paper because there's something buried inside of here that I think is going to be helpful for understanding later parts of Cyrille's career and thinking. In this document, Cyrille goes deeply down the rabbit hole of exploring how patterns can be created with poi, articulating concepts around building what were known as elliptical caps in a variety of different fashions. But also nestled in here was a gem that became a huge influence on me, an interpretation of timing and direction through a vastly different lens than any I'd encountered up to that point. See, while pioneers like Nick Woolsey had kind of whittled down timing and direction to the 4 modes or elements that we all learn as beginners today, Cyrille wanted to take this concept a step further. He wanted to understand not just what the 4 most distinct timing and direction modes were, but what aesthetic properties they had. He wanted to know not just what they were, but why you would choose to use one in a particular case. And so he came up with what I've come to think of as the reflection theory of timing and direction. He pointed out that each timing and direction mode has its own unique symmetrical properties. Together Same essentially creates a doubled image for a given pattern, with an audience presented with two copies of the same shape sitting next to each other. With Together Opposite, on the other hand, we see a single shape that is reflected across the performer's center line. We see a shape that is symmetrical in the same ways that our bodies are. In Split Time Opposites, we see a shape that is reflected across a horizontal line, a form of symmetry at odds with our biology, and likely then not a coincidence that it tends to be the hardest for new poi spinners to learn. And in Split Time Same Direction, he noted that the pattern we produce seems reflected across a constantly changing line of symmetry, moving around with our hands. He also compared this to reflecting around a one-dimensional point rather than a full line. And this was an idea that absolutely blew my mind, and that is still the lens through which I teach timing and direction to this very day. I believe Cyrille's paper came out in 2009, at least that's the year I remember attending a lecture by him at Fire Drums where he outlined the principles in it. But he also taught another workshop that same weekend that was radically different. This one on what would come to be the focus of his next major project, contact poi. To say that contact poi seemed to be an exceptionally weird leap to make after a document that goes so hard on pattern spinning is an understatement. Few people at Fire Drums even had the necessary equipment to take his contact poi class, let alone the prerequisite knowledge to get much out of it. But was this really such a huge leap? We've already seen that contact juggling was in Cyrille's wheelhouse for years before he released Manipoi, and I'd argue that there were some signs in his geometry paper that he was moving in a direction like this. Most explicitly, at the end of his paper, he begins speculating on future directions he could explore, and leaves it on the tantalizing idea that, like many other props, we may find ways to reverse which end of the poi is creating a given pattern. Rather than tracing out shapes with the head, instead seeing what happens when shapes are traced out with the handle as the head remains more stable. And y'all, when Cyrille plays with contact poi moves, as the head rolls across his body, we are in territory where the handle traces out shapes around it, to say nothing of the situations in which we see him finding ever more creative techniques to isolate the poi in various gravity-defying ways. In all these scenarios, we are in fact watching him explore just that territory that he was speculating on at the end of his paper. It just led a different direction than the one most contemporary tech heads might have expected. But Manipoi was still something of a watershed moment in the poi world, a moment perceived as a radical departure from what came before. And I think it's important to understand why. What I think that comes down to is that Cyrille developed his own genre of poi by deconstructing the dominant genre of the day. Remember, tech poi centered around creating geometric patterns. This required people thinking of the path the poi head would follow over time as one unbroken shape, rather than a series of individual moments strung together. It centered on the poi being constantly in motion with a more or less constant level of acceleration present on the prop. And it existed in what appeared to be a nearly flat plane, as though performing on a screen for an audience, even if one was performing in person. Cyrille more or less threw all of those rules out the window and proceeded to write new ones. Rather than focusing on the patterns the path of the poi would create over time, Cyrille focused instead on creating individual moments, setups and payoffs with a clear beginning, middle, and end. He would play around with contrasts in motion, sometimes creating long phrases that would surprise the audience in their length and the twists and turns that they would literally take, and sometimes creating moments of stillness and calm. And he would expand the dimensions of poi performance, playing around not only with levels, but also depth, sometimes bringing the poi and the performer closer to the audience and sometimes farther away. He is one of very few poi performers who truly creates a sense of depth with their work. Several years ago, when Norm Macdonald died, I saw many comedians refer to him as a comedian who they respected, specifically because he would explore and deconstruct the structure of comedy itself and use it to create moments that shouldn't work, but did. He was influential for challenging the idea of what comedy could and could not do by breaking the fundamental rules of what made comedy work and inadvertently building up new ones in the process. I remember taking to social media after this and asking my poi peers whether they could think of anyone in the poi world who'd had a similar impact. Someone who had deconstructed poi down to understand what made it tick and rebuilt it in their own image. To my great frustration, it was a question people seemed not only unable to answer, but actually pretty uncomfortable to be confronted with in the first place. And all these years later, I have to say that if we have that figure in the poi world, then Cyrille must almost certainly be the best example of it that I can think of. Not only did he challenge the boundaries of what exactly we consider poi to be, he had an influence that has radically shifted the aesthetic choices of an entire community as a result. But as much as I think that poi has changed the vocabulary of poi and many of its fundamentals, I also think that a lot of people who've followed in his footsteps also missed a lot of the point. Let me show you what I mean. This is Cyrille performing some of his tricks on stage, and this is Cassandra Smythe performing some tricks that were either invented directly by Cyrille or are performed in his tradition. Notice anything different? Here, I'll zoom in a bit to make it more obvious. The difference here is not in the poi, it's in everything else. Cyrille's work took him to a place of exploring poi within the context more broadly of other movement arts, including dance. When you see his work in many of his videos, he is engaging his entire body, leaping, twirling, rolling around on the ground, even trying to make both he and his poi appear to be melting. And yet, if we look at the multitude of his imitators and followers, something immediately jumps out, at least to me. None of them are copying this aspect of his style. Rather, their posture is a holdover from the tech poi era, in which, partly by necessity and partly as a result of the video format, tech poi spinners adopted a rigid stance we've come to call the tech tree. But Cyrille doesn't tech tree. In fact, I'd argue that much of the style he explored in the trio of videos that established manipulation as a poi genre is a direct reaction to, if not full-on repudiation of tech poi, and his rejection of the tech tree as one of the many elements of this. Now let me show you another comparison. Here's Cyrille leaping with his poi, and here's me leaping with my poi. We're both exploring more of the space around us than Cassandra does, so why do people perceive Cassandra as being closer to Cyrille stylistically than I am? This question right here gets to the heart of what I think Cyrille was trying to achieve. Cyrille's manipulation work may exist as something of a reaction to the conventions of earlier tech poi, but it also has a very important theme coursing through it, one of exploring space and geometry. Just because he's not performing flowers in Melting Poi doesn't mean Cyrille isn't still exploring shapes. So many of the moments that he creates are specifically geared towards turning not just the poi, but his entire body into a medium for creating dramatic silhouettes and bursts of movement. See, Cyrille and I fundamentally reached a similar point. We got burnt out on the rigidity of tech poi and opted to go down paths of fundamentally deconstructing poi itself. We both looked for answers in other performance traditions, me in dance and he in both dance and circus, and we both arrived at a place of integrating the poi and the body of the performer. But we differed on one huge fundamental question. To me, the poi is an extension of the performer. It became a tool for amplifying their thoughts, feelings, and desires. Cyrille, on the other hand, sought to abstract down the human body to being a prop in and of itself. His work centers on the merger of the body and the prop to create abstract moments of movement, stillness, and shapes. Cyrille's style is very cold, rational, and abstract. Mine is very passionate, explosive, and emotional. This is the reason that folks following Cyrille's style are still recognizable as doing such despite how little they actually engage their bodies. They likewise are taking from his tradition of rationalism and abstraction and applying it to the human body. Tech treeing is simply another such form of that abstraction. I believe that there is an artistic through-line for Cyrille reaching all the way back through his paper on poi spinning and geometry and into his manipulation era that centers around finding aesthetic beauty in abstraction, whether it be the patterns poi produces or their interactions with the human body. I think that Cyrille thrives on creating tension around moments of drama wherein a body is flying through the air or passing through moments of precarious balance to try and find stable and harmonious shapes to settle into on the other side. This is definitely a performance convention borrowed from juggling, as it centers around creating moments of peril from which the performer delivers resolution. And I think he frequently challenges himself to see just how far he can extend a moment. Where can the poi explore, and how can the performer keep the momentum going to find new potential in a movement phrase that started in a radically different place? In a way, that final point may actually be a great metaphor for Cyrille's career as a whole, seeking out new and unexpected ways that ideas can be embellished to find surprising new ways to use the prop. But either way, I do think that there is one conclusion that is inescapable. If you want to learn to spin poi like Cyrille, really like him, and not just borrowing superficial elements of his style, you're going to have to learn how to move your body too. Even if it's simply to transform that body into another abstract but beautiful shape. What do you all think? Are you a fan of Cyrille's style? What's your favorite Cyrille video? Leave me a comment and let me know. And also let me know if this video helped you see his work in a new light. This channel is just getting started, so if you dug this video, please make sure to leave it a like and subscribe to the channel so you get to see more like it in the future. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this one got your gears turning. Take care and check out some of my own poi dance videos on this channel. Maybe you'll find something in them that inspires you.